My fiance's father asked me to meet him in the parking lot behind a hardware store 19 days before our wedding, and I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the car. He wasn't the kind of man who did vague. Richard was a calendar invite, polished shoes, let me know a week in advance kind of person. He was also the kind of father who had spent the last year treating me with a kind of measured approval that felt almost professional. Never overly warm, never fake, but solid, respectful, predictable. So when he texted me, "Need 10 minutes, please don't tell Emily," my first thought wasn't family emergency, it was, what the hell did I do? He was standing beside his car with a coffee in one hand and a white envelope in the other. No smile, no small talk, just tired eyes and a face that looked older than it had at our engagement dinner a month earlier. "I appreciate you coming," he said. Should I be worried? Yes. That was it. No easing into it, no, this is awkward, just yes. He motioned toward the passenger seat of his car. I didn't love that. Something about sitting inside another man's car while he looked like he was about to ruin my life felt too much like an interrogation room. But the parking lot was windy and half full of people loading bags of compost into their trunks, so I got in. He sat in the driver's seat, shut the door, and put the envelope on the center console between us. "I'm going to say something that's going to sound insane," he said. "And if your first instinct is to tell me to go to hell, that's fair." I looked at the envelope. What is this? Money. For what? He didn't answer right away. He stared through the windshield for a few seconds like he was trying to figure out whether there was still a version of this conversation where he didn't have to say it. "Walk away from the wedding," he said finally. "Take the money, call it off, and walk away." I actually laughed because it was too absurd to process any other way. What? There's 20,000 in there. If that's not enough to cover whatever you lose, I'll cover the rest. I turned and looked at him properly because I thought maybe I'd misheard him. "You're offering me money to leave your daughter?" "I'm offering you money to leave before she makes you impossible promises she can't keep." For a second, I genuinely thought he might be having some kind of breakdown. That or this was the ugliest rich family power move I'd ever been on the receiving end of. Emily's family had money in that quiet old way where nobody ever talked about it, but it was always there. Country club weddings, lake house summers, no one checking prices at restaurants. I grew up in a house where my dad fixed our washing machine with YouTube tutorials because replacing it wasn't an option. So yeah, my first reaction was that this was class snobbery dressed up as concern. I pushed the envelope back toward him. "If you don't think I'm good enough for her, just say that." He didn't touch the envelope. "If I thought you weren't good enough for her, I'd have made your life miserable a year ago." "Then what is this?" His jaw tightened. "This is me trying to do one decent thing before I die." I stared at him. That line didn't sound rehearsed. It didn't sound manipulative. It sounded like a man who hated himself for being in the car with me. I should have left anyway. I know that. But there's a tone people get when they're finally saying the thing they've been sitting on too long, and Richard had it. Not anger, not even urgency, just this flat, exhausted certainty that whatever came next was going to be ugly, and he was done pretending otherwise. He reached into his jacket pocket and slid a storage receipt across the console. I looked down. It was for a storage facility on Hawthorne, paid 3 days earlier. Unit number, monthly charge, Emily's name. I frowned. "Okay. Ask Emily why she still has it." I looked back at him. "That's what this is? A storage unit?" "Ask her why she still has it and ask her who Michael is." There are moments where your brain catches on something before you understand why. That name hit me like that. Not because I knew a Michael, I didn't, but because of the way he said it. Not as a guess, not as fishing, like a man placing a loaded gun on a table and stepping back from it. "Who's Michael?" I asked. His eyes dropped for half a second. "If I say too much, she'll know exactly where it came from, and she'll get in front of it before you can see anything clearly." I almost laughed again, but there was no humor left in me now. "You just offered me 20 grand to cancel my wedding and you're talking in riddles." "I know. Then stop." He rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked suddenly older than I'd ever seen him. Emily has a habit of not leaving one life before she starts building another. I sat there waiting for the rest. That was all he gave me. No dramatic confession. No, "she's cheating on you." No big speech about her past. Just that one sentence and the storage receipt and a name. I hated him for how little that should have meant and how immediately it did. Because Emily did still have that storage unit. I knew that. She'd mentioned it in passing once when we moved into our apartment together, said it had old junk and some furniture I keep meaning to deal with. I never thought about it again, because why would I? People have storage units, people keep old junk, that's not a scandal.
But now I was replaying every weird, small, stupid thing I'd ignored because I trusted her. The fact that she'd gone there alone 2 weeks earlier and come back weirdly defensive when I asked why it had taken so long. The fact that she once snapped at me for suggesting we finally clear it out before the wedding because not everything has to be dealt with on your timeline. The fact that she hated talking about her last serious relationship with a level of intensity that always felt slightly out of proportion to the question being asked. Richard opened the envelope and turned it toward me. I saw stacks of $100 bills. Real money. Not symbolic, not a bluff. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said. I wouldn't. But if you're going to marry her, at least go into it knowing who else has a key to that unit. That landed. I looked up slowly. What? He held my stare. That's all I'm going to say. Who else has a key? No answer. Richard. His face hardened in that way men's faces do when they've decided being hated is better than saying more. If you ask her tonight, she'll cry, she'll tell you I've always held her past against her, and she'll find a way to make you feel cruel for asking. Maybe she'll even believe half of what she says. But if you want the truth, don't ask her first. I should have gotten out of the car and called Emily immediately. It would have been the normal thing to do. Instead, I sat there another 30 seconds, staring at the envelope and the storage receipt, and the man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth than in that car with me. Then I took the receipt, left the money, and got out without another word.
The whole drive home, I kept trying to turn what he'd said into something harmless. Maybe Michael was an old coworker who helped her move furniture years ago and still had a key by accident. Maybe Richard was one of those fathers who never forgave his daughter for being messy in her 20s and decided every man after that needed a warning label. Maybe the "one life before another" line was just his melodramatic way of saying she used to monkey branch between relationships and he'd never let it go. All of those explanations were possible. What bothered me was that none of them made me feel better. Emily was on the living room floor when I got home, surrounded by seating charts, linen samples, and little cream place cards with everyone's names written in her neat, slanted handwriting. The dog was asleep beside her with his head on her leg. She looked up when I came in and smiled. Thank God, my mother changed her mind about the rehearsal dinner seating, and I'm about to commit a felony. It should have grounded me. That scene should have made the whole thing feel stupid. My fiancé, our apartment, our dog, our wedding scattered across the rug. Real life, not some paranoid story her father was trying to plant in my head. Instead, all I could think was, who else has a key? She must have seen something on my face because her smile faded almost immediately. What happened? I set my keys on the counter. Your dad wanted to talk. Her body went still in a way that was subtle enough I might have missed it any other day. Just a slight pause, the hand holding the pen stopping in midair. About what? I took off my jacket slowly, buying myself time. He, asked me about your storage unit on Hawthorne. That was it. That was all I said. The color drained out of her face so fast it felt like watching someone get slapped. She stood up. Why would he do that? Not, what did he say, not, what do you mean? Straight to, why would he do that? I felt my stomach turn over. I don't know, I said. Why would he? Her eyes flicked away from mine for a second, then back. Because he's obsessed with things that aren't his business. What things? She crossed her arms. Can you just tell me what he said? That answer did something ugly to me. Not because it was incriminating by itself, but because it was exactly the tone of someone trying to find out how much cleanup they needed to do before the flood reached the first floor. He asked why you still pay for it, I said. She let out a laugh that sounded too sharp to be real. That's what this is? A storage unit? That's what I'm asking you. It's old stuff, Chris. Furniture, boxes, things from before we moved in together. I've told you that. You told me that once. You also got weird when I suggested we clear it out. Because not every old thing in my life needs to be dug up and sorted through before your preferred deadline. That annoyed little edge in her voice almost worked. It almost pushed me back into the familiar rhythm where I was the practical one and she was the one with emotional clutter, and we both rolled our eyes and moved on.
Then I remembered Richard's exact wording. If you're going to marry her, at least go into it knowing who else has a key to that unit. I looked at her and said, "Who's Michael?" The pen dropped out of her hand and hit the hardwood. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a tiny, stupid sound in a suddenly dead, silent room. She didn't answer. I don't know how long we stood there. 5 seconds, maybe 10. Long enough for the dog to wake up and look between us like even he knew something had gone wrong. Emily. Her mouth opened, then closed. "Who is Michael?" I asked again. She took one step back like I'd moved toward her, even though I hadn't. "Did my father say that name to you?" That wasn't an answer. "Who is he?" Her eyes filled instantly, not with the kind of crying that spills over, but that glossy, dangerous look she got when she was trying to hold on to control by her fingernails. He had no right. There it was. Not, "There's no Michael." Not, "You've got this wrong." Not even, "Let me explain." Just, he had no right.
I felt something cold settle into place inside me. What exactly did he have no right to tell me? She shook her head hard. You don't understand the context. Then give it to me. It's not that simple. Emily. She covered her mouth with one hand and looked away. Can we not do this like this? That was the first moment I knew, really knew, that there was a version of her life I had never been allowed to see. If she'd laughed, if she'd rolled her eyes and told me Michael was some old family friend or a former landlord or literally anything clean and boring, maybe I would have taken the bait. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But she didn't. She looked like someone who just heard a floorboard crack under her weight and wasn't sure whether to run or freeze. I said, "Did he have a key to your storage unit?" Her face changed. Not shocked, not confused, caught. And then, instead of answering, she did something that made my skin go cold. She reached for her phone, not to call her father, not to call me crazy. She just grabbed it off the table and turned away from me with her thumb already moving across the screen. Who you texting? I asked. No one. Emily. I'm not doing this if you're gonna stand over me like a cop. She tried to walk past me toward the hallway. I stepped in front of her before I even thought about it. Not grabbing her, not aggressive, just blocking the path because every alarm in my body was screaming the same thing now. She is trying to get ahead of this. Who you texting? Move! Who? Her jaw clenched. You're scaring me. That was the first thing she said all night that made me angry instead of sick. I held my hand out. Give me the phone. No. Then unlock it. Absolutely not. Emily, if this is nothing, then unlock the phone. She laughed at that. One short, disgusted laugh like I'd just proved something pathetic about myself. This is exactly why I didn't want him dragging you into this. Into what? She looked me dead in the face and said, my life before you. That sentence was so carefully chosen it almost impressed me. Not my ex, not a mistake, not someone I used to be involved with, my life before you. As if I was the one being unreasonable for not wanting some other man with a key to my fiancé's hidden storage unit floating around in the background 3 weeks before our wedding. I dropped my hand. Okay, I said. She blinked. Okay? Yeah, you're right. I'm not doing this, standing here while you figure out who you need to warn first. Her face went white again. I grabbed my keys off the counter and walked out before she could say another word. She followed me into the hallway, barefoot, still holding the phone. Chris, stop. Where are you going? I hit the elevator button and didn't answer. Please don't do this dramatic disappearing act. That almost made me turn around because dramatic was rich, coming from the woman who looked like she'd seen a body when I said one man's name. The elevator opened. I stepped inside. Chris, the doors started to close. Right before they did, she said, if you go to that unit without talking to me first, you're not going to understand what you're looking at. That line sat in my head the entire drive across town. Not, there's nothing there. Not, don't invade my privacy. You're not going to understand what you're looking at.
By the time I pulled into the Hawthorne storage lot, it was after 8 and the place was almost empty. One security light buzzed over the office door, and the rows of metal units looked like shut mouths in the dark. I sat in the car for a full minute with the engine running, staring at the keypad gate and trying to decide whether I'd crossed some line I couldn't uncross. Then I thought about Emily grabbing her phone the second I said Michael's name. I drove in. I didn't have a key, obviously, but I did have the access code Emily once asked me to punch in when she was driving and eating fries at the same time. I remembered it because it was her college apartment number twice in a row, and I made fun of how uncreative it was. Unit 214 was halfway down the third row. The padlock hanging on it wasn't locked. That's the part that still gets me, because if it had been locked, maybe I would have turned around. Maybe the tiny extra step of having to break something would have made me stop and think. But it wasn't. Someone had either just been there or was planning to come back. All I had to do was lift the latch. I stood there with my hand on the cold metal handle, listening to my own breathing. Then I opened it. The first thing I saw was a framed engagement photo leaning against a stack of plastic bins. Not mine. Emily, younger by a few years but unmistakably Emily, standing on a dock at sunset with a man I'd never seen in person but recognized immediately from the panic on her face when I'd said his name. Michael. His arm around her waist, her hand on his chest, both of them smiling at the camera like people who thought they still had a whole life ahead of them. Behind it was a garment bag from a bridal boutique, and stacked beside that, tied in a pale blue ribbon gun yellow at the edges, were 3 boxes of wedding invitation samples with E+M written on the top in Emily's handwriting. For a few seconds, I genuinely couldn't move. Not because I was shocked she'd had a life before me. I wasn't a child. I knew she'd loved other people, lived with other people, almost built futures with other people. That wasn't the part that hollowed me out. It was the way it was all still there. Not shoved into one forgotten box at the back like something you never got around to dealing with, not dusty leftovers from a bad breakup. This wasn't abandoned junk. It was arranged. Not neatly exactly, but deliberately, like a room someone came back to when they needed to remember who they'd been. The engagement photo was propped where you'd see it immediately. The garment bag wasn't buried under furniture, it was hanging from a metal rack by itself. The wedding invitation boxes were stacked carefully, not crushed under years of random storage. There was even a small lamp on top of one of the bins, the kind you bring if you know you'll be opening boxes after dark. I stepped inside and pulled the unit door down halfway behind me because suddenly I had the sick, irrational feeling that I was trespassing in someone's second apartment, not a storage locker. The air smelled like cardboard, dust, and that faint stale sweetness old fabric gets when it's been sealed away too long. I picked up the top invitation box.
Inside were sample cards from a stationer, thick ivory paper, blue-gray script, RSVP inserts, wax seal options, envelope liners, a little bundle of ribbon tied around one corner. On the back of one card, in Emily's handwriting, was "Michael hates Sarah fonts. Keep him away from this decision." I just stood there looking at it. That one stupid sentence made the whole thing feel 100 times more intimate than the photo had. Not because it was romantic, because it was domestic, familiar, private, the kind of dumb little note you make while building a life with someone, the kind of thing you don't keep by accident for years unless some part of you still lives in it. The second box had swatches of bridesmaids' dress fabric, a sample menu card, and a folded seating chart with guest names scribbled out and rewritten. There were circles around 2 tables and a note in the corner that said, "Move Richard's sister farther from bar or she'll start a fight with Michael's mother." I actually sat down on one of the plastic bins because my legs stopped feeling reliable. This wasn't, "I never got around to throwing away old things." This was a whole unfinished wedding still breathing in the dark. I opened the garment bag next. Inside was a dress. Not a full wedding gown, but one of those white-fitted rehearsal dinner dresses or civil ceremony dresses that people buy for one of the dozen events orbiting a wedding now. There was a dry cleaning tag still pinned to the sleeve with Emily's maiden name and a date from 4 years earlier. In the pocket of the garment bag was a folded hotel key sleeve. The logo on the front made my stomach twist because I knew it immediately. It was the same boutique hotel downtown Emily had refused to use for our welcome dinner. The one she'd called overpriced and pretentious, even though it was exactly the kind of place she normally loved. Inside the sleeve was an old room key and a receipt for room service under the name Emily Carter. Not Emily's last name, Michael's. I had to put it down because my hand started shaking so badly I nearly tore the paper. That's when my phone buzzed. Emily. Then again. I declined all 3 and kept digging.
One of the bins held framed photos wrapped in towels. Some were ordinary enough, lake weekends, Christmas mornings, a group shot at what looked like someone's engagement party. But Michael was everywhere. Not in a way that screamed affair or secret. Worse than that, in a way that made it obvious he had once been threaded through her whole life so completely that removing him later had probably felt like ripping wiring out of a wall. At the bottom of that same bin was a small leather album. I almost didn't open it because by then I felt physically sick. But I did. It was a venue album from a vineyard 2 hours outside the city. A coordinator's packet tucked into the front. Deposit receipts, a sample timeline, ceremony at 5:30, cocktail hour at 6:15, first dance at 8:10. Emily had highlighted pieces of it in pale pink. Halfway through the album, a folded note slid out and landed in my lap. I unfolded it. It wasn't a love letter. I think part of me was still bracing for something like that. Something dramatic and obvious I could point to and say, "There, that's the betrayal." Instead, it was a page torn from a yellow legal pad in Emily's handwriting. It looked like a list. Things I can't say out loud. I don't know if I loved Daniel or just loved being loved by him. I missed the version of myself that existed with Michael the first. Keep thinking stability is the same thing as certainty. I don't know how to choose without making myself the villain in someone else's story. I am so tired of needing one person to calm me down and another person to make me feel alive. I read it 3 times before it fully sank in. That note wasn't about me.
The dates on the packet made that clear. It was years old, from before she'd ever met me. But it might as well have been about me too, because it was the first time I could see the shape of what Richard had tried and failed to explain in the car. Emily didn't move from one relationship to another. She stacked them. She built stability with one man while keeping another one alive in the wall.
My phone buzzed again. Then again. Finally, I answered, because if I didn't, I was going to smash it against the concrete floor. What? There was a second of silence on her end, like she was checking my tone against her worst-case scenario. "Are you there?" she asked. I looked around the unit, at the engagement photo, at the dress, at the boxes with E+M on them, at the hotel key from a hotel she'd lied about hating, at the note in my hand. "What do you think?" She made a sound I'd never heard from her before, not crying exactly, more like someone exhaling after a car crash. "Chris, listen to me carefully." "No, you listen to me. You told me it was old furniture and junk. I'm sitting in a fucking mausoleum to your old engagement. It's not what it looks like." I laughed so hard it hurt my throat. "There's a hotel key in here with your name as Emily Carter." Silence. Then, very quietly, "Please don't go through everything." That line was so wrong it actually calmed me down. All the confusion, all the hope that maybe there was some version of this that was ugly but survivable, started draining out of me right there. "Why does he have a key?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Why does Michael have a key to this unit?" "I was going to tell you." "Bullshit. I was." "When? After the honeymoon?" Her breathing hitched. "It's not like that." "Then tell me what it's like." Nothing. I stood up and started pacing the tiny strip of floor between the bins and the door, because if I stayed still, I thought I might put my fist through the metal wall. "You know what the worst part is?" I said. "It's not even the old engagement stuff. It's that none of this looks forgotten. It looks curated. It looks like somewhere you come to keep a version of yourself alive. Chris? No, you don't get to Chris me right now. Did you come here with him?" Silence again. I looked at the open album in my lap, at the highlighted timeline, and felt something cold spread through my chest. "Were you here with him recently?" Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Yes." I shut my eyes. "How recently?" "I don't know." "Try." 2 weeks ago. That was the day she told me she was picking up table linens for the rehearsal dinner. I leaned back against the wall of the unit and covered my eyes with one hand because suddenly I couldn't stand the fluorescent buzz overhead. "Why?" "We were sorting things." "Sorting what?" "Our stuff." I lowered my hand and stared at the boxes around me. "Emily, there is no our stuff here that makes sense to still be sorting. You're getting married in 19 days. "I know." "Then why are you doing this with him?"
I heard her crying now. Real crying, or good enough that I couldn't tell anymore. Because every time I tried to deal with it alone, I froze, and because he knows what's in there. That answer made me laugh again, but this time there was no edge left in it, just disgust. He knows what's in there because half of it is his? I know. And you thought that was a normal sentence to say out loud while planning a wedding with someone else? No, I thought if I could just clear it out before the wedding, it would finally be over. That was the first honest-sounding thing she'd said all night, and I hated how much I believed it. Not because it made anything better, because it made it worse. It meant she had known this couldn't come with her into a marriage, and still chose to drag it right up to the finish line before trying to bury it. "Did you sleep with him?" I asked. "No." "Did you want to?" She didn't answer fast enough. I hung up. I spent another 20 minutes in the unit, not because I wanted more proof, but because I couldn't seem to make myself leave without understanding how bad it really was. And the answer was bad enough. In one of the back bins, I found a stack of old birthday cards held together with a rubber band. Some were from Michael, some from Emily to him, and most of them were ordinary in the way long relationships are ordinary. Inside jokes, dumb nicknames, scribbled apologies after fights, sorry I was impossible this week, notes, that kind of thing. But tucked in the middle was one card that wasn't old enough to belong there. The postmark was from 8 months before my proposal. Inside, in Michael's handwriting, it said, "I know you keep trying to make yourself into someone who doesn't need me. I'm not asking you to stop getting married or stop wanting the life you want. I'm just asking you not to pretend I was only a mistake. You don't keep a key to a graveyard." I read that line 3 times.
I'm not asking you to stop getting married. Not to stop dating someone else. Not to move on. Getting married. He knew. He had known she was with me, known it was serious enough to be heading somewhere permanent, and instead of disappearing like any decent person with half a conscience would, he'd stayed exactly where he'd always been, close enough to be chosen if she panicked. I took a photo of the card, the hotel receipt, the engagement picture, the note, and the invitation boxes. Then I put everything back exactly where I found it, shut the unit, and sat in my car with the lights off for almost an hour. Emily texted 17 times. Most of it was the same cycle in different words. Please let me explain. This is old. I know how it looks. I should have told you sooner. My father has made this so much worse. Please come home. I love you. The last one made me throw the phone onto the passenger seat so hard it bounced off the door. I didn't go home. I got a room at an airport hotel because it was the first thing I passed the head of vacancy sign, and I sat on the edge of the bed until 2 in the morning, reading those photos over and over, like if I stared at them long enough they'd rearrange themselves into a version of my life that still made sense. The next morning, Richard called. I let it ring out the first time, picked up on the second. I assume you went. Yeah. Silence. Was I wrong? He asked.
That almost broke something in me, because there was no satisfaction in his voice, just this awful, defeated hope that maybe I'd tell him he'd blown up his daughter's life over nothing. No, I said. He exhaled like he'd been punched. Come by the house, he said. There's something else you need to know before you talk to her. I almost told him to go to hell. I was sick of being drip-fed pieces of my own relationship by other people. But there was something in the way he said it, less dramatic than before, more resigned, that made me go. He was waiting for me in the kitchen with 2 coffees and a file folder. Not a metaphorical folder, a real one. Manila, worn at the corners, thick enough that I immediately hated it. I looked at it and said, if you had this the whole time, I'm going to have a hard time not blaming you too. You should blame me too, he said. That shut me up. He sat across from me and pushed the folder toward me. Inside were printouts, not photos, not love letters, bank statements, hotel confirmations, a few email chains, copies of things, not originals, the kind of paper trail a guilty parent keeps when they've spent years telling themselves they're only holding on to it in case it's needed someday. What am I looking at? He folded his hands together so tightly the knuckles went white. The first time Emily and Michael almost got married, she called it off 6 weeks before because she found out he'd been sleeping with someone from work. 3 months later, she went back to him anyway. The second time she tried to leave him, she got with Daniel before she'd actually cut Michael off. Daniel found out, the engagement blew up, and Emily spent almost a year bouncing between the two of them. I looked up slowly. The second time? Richard nodded once. There were 2 engagements with Michael? Yes. I just stared at him. That changed everything. Not because it made the betrayal worse in some abstract moral sense, but because it turned the storage unit from a graveyard into a loop. It wasn't just leftovers from a relationship she'd once failed to leave. It was evidence of a life she had tried, abandoned, restarted, abandoned again, and never actually buried. Richard slid one of the hotel confirmations out of the folder and tapped the date. It was from 11 months before my proposal. The hotel was the same one whose key I'd found in the garment bag. The guest name on the booking was Emily Carter. My mouth went dry. She told me that trip was a work conference, I said. Richard didn't answer. I looked at the date again and did the math in my head. 11 months before my proposal meant roughly 8 months into our relationship. Not before me, during me. I looked up at him, and for the first time since the parking lot, his eyes actually dropped from mine. Did she sleep with him? I asked. I don't know, he said. It might have been the truth. It didn't matter, because at that point the damage wasn't in whether she had physically cheated in a hotel room. The damage was in the fact that while I was falling in love with her, introducing her to my parents, letting her leave a toothbrush at my place, and believing we were building something clean, she was still checking into hotels under another man's name. Richard finally said the thing I think he should have said in that car the day before. You are not the first man she's tried to build a stable future with while still keeping Michael alive in the background, he said. You're just the first one I liked enough to warn.
He was waiting for me in the kitchen with 2 coffees and a file folder. Not a metaphorical folder, a real one. Manila. Worn at the corners. thick enough that I immediately hated it. I looked at it and said, "If you had this the whole time, I'm going to have a hard time not blaming you too." "You should blame me too," he said. That shut me up. He sat across from me and pushed the folder toward me. Inside were printouts. Not photos, not love letters, bank statements, hotel confirmations, a few email chains. Copies of things, not originals. The kind of paper trail a guilty parent keeps when they've spent years telling themselves they're only holding on to it in case it's needed someday. What am I looking at? He folded his hands together so tightly the knuckles went white. The first time Emily and Michael almost got married, she called it off 6 weeks before because she found out he'd been sleeping with someone from work. 3 months later, she went back to him anyway. The second time she tried to leave him, she got with Daniel before she'd actually cut Michael off. Daniel found out, the engagement blew up, and Emily spent almost a year bouncing between the two of them. I looked up slowly. The second time? Richard nodded once. There were 2 engagements with Michael? Yes. I just stared at him. That changed everything. Not because it made the betrayal worse in some abstract moral sense, but because it turned the storage unit from a graveyard into a loop. It wasn't just leftovers from a relationship she'd once failed to leave. It was evidence of a life she had tried, abandoned, restarted, abandoned again, and never actually buried. Richard slid one of the hotel confirmations out of the folder and tapped the date. It was from 11 months before my proposal. The hotel was the same one whose key I'd found in the garment bag. The guest name on the booking was Emily Carter. My mouth went dry. She told me that trip was a work conference, I said. Richard didn't answer. I looked at the date again and did the math in my head. 11 months before my proposal meant roughly 8 months into our relationship. Not before me, during me. I looked up at him, and for the first time since the parking lot, his eyes actually dropped from mine. Did she sleep with him? I don't know, he said. It might have been the truth. It didn't matter. Because at that point, the damage wasn't in whether she had physically cheated in a hotel room. The damage was in the fact that while I was falling in love with her, introducing her to my parents, letting her leave a toothbrush at my place and believing we were building something clean, she was still checking into hotels under another man's name. Richard finally said the thing I think he should have said in that car the day before. You are not the first man she's tried to build a stable future with while still keeping Michael alive in the background, he said. You're just the first one I liked enough to warn.
That was the moment I knew I wasn't going to postpone the wedding. I was going to end it. I ended the wedding 2 days later, but the part that actually killed it happened the night before. I wish I could say I went straight from Richard's kitchen to Emily, threw the ring on the counter, and walked away like someone with dignity. I didn't. I went back to the hotel, sat on the edge of the bed with that folder in my lap, and spent half the night trying to decide whether there was any version of this that wasn't terminal. That sounds pathetic now, but if you've never had your whole relationship split open in stages, it's hard to explain how badly your brain wants one final piece of information that magically makes the rest survivable. I wasn't trying to prove she was innocent. I was trying to figure out whether what she'd done lived in the category of damaged, selfish, deeply unfair person I can't marry, or pathological liar who built our entire relationship on a trap door. By midnight, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't do it over text, and I couldn't do it over the phone. So I texted her one sentence. Tomorrow, your apartment, no parents, no excuses. If you lie to me one more time, we're done before you finish the sentence. She replied almost immediately, Please just let me explain in person, please. I didn't answer. The next day, I went to our apartment at 7. I still think of it as hours out of habit, even though by then it already felt like a crime scene with matching throw pillows. Emily had clearly been waiting for hours. The apartment was spotless in that aggressive way people clean when they're trying to control one tiny corner of their life. The candles she normally lit when she wanted the place to feel cozy were gone. The wedding binder was gone. The invitation samples for our wedding were gone too, which I noticed immediately and hated her for noticing that I'd notice. She looked awful. Swollen eyes, no makeup, hair tied back badly, one of my old sweatshirts on.
If I had walked in cold, without the last 48 hours in my head, I probably would have folded right there. Instead, I put Richard's folder on the kitchen island between us and said, "You get one shot at this." She looked at the folder and actually closed her eyes for a second. "Chris, one shot. No framing it around your father. No, it's not what it looks like. No, telling me I'm overreacting. I want the truth in the order it happened, and if I find out you skipped something important, we're done." She was already crying before I finished. "I'm not trying to manipulate you," she said quietly. I laughed once. That's not a promising start. She sat down at the kitchen stool like her legs had gone weak. I stayed standing because I didn't trust myself to sit across from her like we were about to work through a budget problem. For a long time, she just stared at her hands. Then she said, "Michael was the person I was with before Daniel, and after Daniel, and before you."
Not exactly a confession, more like the opening line of one. "How many times were you engaged to him?" She looked up sharply. "My father told you that?" "Answer." "Twice." I nodded once, because hearing it out loud somehow still felt worse. "The first time was when I was 24, she said. "The second time was after Daniel and I ended." "Why didn't either of them stick?" She gave this awful little smile that lasted less than a second. Not because anything was funny, because she already knew how bad the answer sounded. "Because Michael was the worst person I ever couldn't leave." That line would have wrecked me 2 years earlier. That night it just made me tired. "So what was I?" Her face folded immediately. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make this into some competition between you and him." I actually had to turn away for a second because I couldn't believe she'd said it. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so perfectly Emily. Even now, even with the wreckage sitting between us on the counter, she was still trying to reframe the conversation into something that protected her from the ugliest version of the truth.
I turned back and said, "You checked into a hotel under his last name 8 months into our relationship. I found a card from him talking about me like I was some future husband you were trying to squeeze into your life without giving him up. So no, I'm not making it a competition. You already did that." That hit. She started crying harder, but she didn't deny it. I asked her about the hotel first, because that was the part one couldn't stop replaying. She said it happened during a period when Michael had reached out after months of silence. He was in a bad place. He'd heard she was seeing someone serious. He wanted closure. He wanted to return some things. He wanted to talk about what had happened between them like adults. I just stared at her until she stopped talking. "You hear how disgusting that sounds, right?" She wiped her face with both hands. "I know. No, I don't think you do. You're telling me you checked into a hotel under another man's last name while dating me because he needed closure? It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like." She looked at the folder, at the printouts, at the photo I'd left on top from the storage unit. Then she said the first genuinely honest thing I'd heard from her since this started. "I wanted to see if he still had the power to ruin me." That shut me up. Not because it made anything better, because it was the first sentence that sounded ugly enough to be true.
She told me Michael had been the relationship she never emotionally recovered from because it was the one that trained her to confuse instability with intensity. He cheated, disappeared, came back, proposed when he felt her slipping away, withdrew when she got too close, and somehow always managed to make her feel like she was one conversation away from either getting the life she wanted or losing it forever. Richard had been right, in a way that made my skin crawl. Michael wasn't just an ex. He was the person around whom she'd built years of indecision, fantasy, shame, and unfinished versions of herself. Then Daniel came along. Safe, kind, stable Daniel. The kind of man who looked good in every family photo and remembered to book the flights and ask her mother about her knee surgery. She said yes to his proposal because she thought maybe stability would become love if she leaned into it hard enough. Instead, Michael resurfaced, and Emily let him. At first secretly, then sloppily, then in ways she couldn't even defend to herself. Daniel found out. The engagement ended. Michael promised things. Michael backed out. Michael came back. Emily went back. Michael proposed again. Emily said yes again. Then she left him again. "And then there was me," I said. She nodded, crying quietly. "And you told yourself this time was different." "Yes. Was it?" She looked at me for a long time before answering. "I wanted it to be." That was not the same answer. I asked her if she'd cheated on me physically. She said no.
Then I asked the question that had been rotting in me since Richard slid that hotel confirmation across the table. "Did you ever think about leaving me for him?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to.
I sat down then because suddenly my knees felt hollow. For a minute, neither of us spoke. The dog wandered in from the hallway and put his head on my thigh like he could feel something was wrong. Emily looked at him and started crying harder, which I found almost insulting. Finally, I said, "Why did you keep the storage unit?" She covered her mouth and looked down. Because I knew if I got rid of it, it would be final. Final with what? With the version of my life where I hadn't made the wrong choice. I stared at her. She kept going because once she started saying the truly ugly things, they came out faster. With Michael, with Daniel, with all of it. The unit wasn't just his stuff. It was proof that those versions of me existed. Proof that I wasn't crazy for loving them. Proof that there had been a version of my life where everything could still be rewritten if I needed it to be. And where did I fit into that? She looked straight at me when she answered, which somehow made it worse. You were the life that made sense. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't laugh, I was going to throw something through the window. The life that made sense. Yes, she whispered. You were kind and steady and honest, and being with you felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of chaos. I wanted that. I wanted you. I loved you. But... She shook her head hard. No, not but. Then finish the sentence honestly. She pressed both palms into her eyes and set it into her hands. I didn't know how to choose you without feeling like I was killing every other version of myself. That was the line. Not the hotel, not the storage unit, not the second engagement. That line.
Because it finally stripped away the last stupid fantasy I'd been carrying, that maybe I'd just gotten unlucky and fallen in love with someone who made one terrible mistake. This wasn't one mistake. It was a worldview, a way of moving through people like they were unfinished drafts of a life she might still want back later. I asked her if she would have married me if I'd never found out. She said yes. I asked if she would have cut Michael off after the wedding. She hesitated, just for a second, barely anything, but I saw it. And then she said the most brutal thing anyone has ever said to me, not because she meant it to be brutal, but because it was obviously the truth and she was too exhausted to dress it up anymore. I knew Michael would never give me the life you could, she said. I just didn't think I had to lose one to keep the other. There it was, the cleanest, ugliest version of the whole story. I wasn't the love of her life. I was the life that worked, the one with health insurance and clean sheets and a husband who'd actually show up. Michael was the private addiction she couldn't quit because part of her still wanted to believe chaos meant destiny, and she genuinely thought she could keep both if she managed it carefully enough. I took my ring off and put it on the counter. She made the small choking sound and stood up so fast the stool tipped backward behind her. Chris, please! No, I know how awful that sounded, but that's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. No, it isn't. I love you. Maybe, I said, but not in a way that makes marriage anything except a trap.
She came around the island toward me, and I stepped back before she could touch me. That hurt her more than anything else I'd said all night. I could see it. You don't get to decide what my intentions were based on the worst sentence I've ever said in my life. I looked at her and thought, that wasn't the worst sentence. It was just the first honest one. The wedding's off, I said. She started shaking her head immediately, panicked now in a way I don't think was performative anymore. No, don't do that tonight. Don't decide tonight. I decided yesterday. Tonight was just your chance to make it somehow less fatal. And I didn't. I picked up the folder. You checked into a hotel under another man's last name while we were together. You hid meetings. You let him keep a key to a storage unit full of your unfinished life. You planned a wedding with me while still treating him like an emergency exit you might need later. So no, Emily, you didn't make it less fatal. She started crying so hard she could barely get words out. And I think if I'd still been in love with the version of her I thought I knew, that would have broken me. But by then, all I could see was the unit on Hawthorne, the invitation boxes with E+M on top, the note about needing one person to calm her down and another to make her feel alive. I left while she was still crying. Her father paid the cancellation fees like he promised. I hated that part. It made me feel like I was being escorted out of a building he known was on fire before I smelled smoke. Emily's mother called me twice and left one voicemail accusing me of humiliating her daughter over old wounds and complicated history, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how Emily got this way. Richard sent me one text 3 days after I moved my things out. You didn't deserve to be put in the middle of a war she never ended. I'm sorry I waited this long. I never replied. As for Emily, I didn't hear from her for about a month after I blocked her. Then a mutual friend told me she'd moved out of the apartment and was staying somewhere upstate for a while. I later found out that somewhere upstate was Michael's place. That should have devastated me. Weirdly, it didn't. By then it almost felt inevitable, like gravity finally getting done what it had been trying to do the whole time.
The part that stayed with me wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was how close I came to marrying someone who was never actually standing in one life at a time. Emily wasn't malicious in the way people like to imagine cheaters are. She wasn't out here twirling a mustache and laughing while she played men against each other. She was worse, in a quieter way. She was the kind of person who believed her fear, her confusion, and her unfinished business were profound enough to justify making other people live inside them. And if Richard hadn't finally hated himself enough to warn me, I would have married her thinking I'd been chosen. That's the part one still can't quite get over. Not that she loved someone else, not even that she lied. It's that I was 2.5 weeks away from promising my life to a woman who looked me in the face every night, let me plan a future with her, and still kept another one in a rented box across town in case she ever needed to go back.